Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome David Lobell from Stanford. He's made a career of looking at stuff from space, from agriculture like today, or poverty, or a bunch of like society, aspects of society. So welcome, David.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Yeah, that was a pretty good one-sentence summary. I've made a career out of looking at things from space and looking just generally at issues around food security. And Greg asked me to talk about both the way we do that and also the applications, the science that we do with that data. And I think it's about 50-50 in my group in terms of generating new data sets and then trying to use those for science. So I'm guessing this is quite a broad audience in terms of interests and backgrounds, but for brevity, I'll just say the reason we do this overall is that a lot of the sustainable development goals, and you may not be familiar with that term, but there's basically a statement of the countries of the world saying things they would like to achieve, like ending poverty, ending hunger, ending climate change. All of these things have a very strong component of agricultural progress. So a lot of our history as a civilization has been centered on agricultural progress, and that's going to have to continue to meet these goals. The problem with agriculture in historically has been that it's very slow to learn what works. It's a very complicated, multivariate system with lots of things changing at once. Any individual farmer is only getting the experience of themselves and maybe their neighbors, but they're very slow to learn what is actually working. Farmers tend to be pretty skeptical of new things. And so there's a need to really accelerate that learning. So that's kind of in general what we're trying to do. In particular, there's millions, hundreds of millions of, you can think of natural experiments being run every year by farmers as they have different practices, different crops, different weather conditions, different soils. And all of this historically has been really not utilized scientifically. We've relied almost entirely on controlled experiments. So we're trying to basically improve the ability to monitor and understand what's going on in the real world and help us then design better systems for growing food. So in terms of this presentation today, I'll talk about a couple of kind of methods or areas of method development that we've been focused on. One is mapping crop types over large scales, think continents to global scales, and also trying to map yields at those same scales. The important distinction being, whereas we've been able to have very broad level monitoring of vegetation basically since satellites have been launched, we haven't been able to resolve individual fields. So when we say large scale, we're talking about the large spatial extent, but implicit in that is trying to actually get down to individual pixels, individual fields, and that will enable additional insights, as we'll talk about. And then in terms of applications, I'll focus on the US. We've done various studies around the world, but two recent ones in the US have focused on understanding the impacts of drought and understanding the impacts of air pollution. And hopefully from that, you get a sense of what it is about these high resolution data sets that help us beyond what we can do with, say, very coarse government level statistics. Now, I'm happy to take questions as they come up, but
I do have one. How big is a field? Do you get a sense of resolution?
Yeah, I mean, the picture shown at the bottom here is of the US, where a field is, in this case, we're looking at, something that's easily a kilometer on a side. But so these would be fairly large fields, something like 100 hectares or 50 hectares, where a hectare is 10,000 square meters. But in some places we're working, as I'll show in a second, we're talking about fields that are 1,000 square meters or maybe even 500 square meters, and that's quite a different ballgame. So what we'd like to do is develop methods that are applicable across this wide range of scales. Okay, thanks. All right, so let's just start with the large scale crop type mapping. And actually this maybe gets to the question just asked. This animation here is a bunch of planet imagery. So the resolution here is about 3 meters. So each pixel is 3 meters. I should have drawn the scale of this entire area here then, but we're looking at an area that's maybe 1 or 2 kilometers on a side. And you're seeing over time these fields change as the season comes along. So that the rainy season in this part of Kenya, typically starting around March. So you'll see the fields kind of be sown and greening up here, and then they get harvested. But you can see different fields are doing different things. And there's a mix of different crops. In any agricultural region, there'll be a mix of different crops. And kind of the first order question we have when we're trying to characterize the landscape is what is being grown where? And, very simple conceptually, you're thinking of what you, in any of these modeling problems, you're thinking of what you can observe, which is denoted here by X, which is typically a time series of imagery. And then what you want is the crop type, in this case, Y, and we're trying to find some mapping of X onto Y. So in general, the challenges we face is finding what we would say are useful features. So what is it in particular that you can measure from space that would tell you what's growing there? Is it just greenness, which is something we can tell fairly easily, or are there other attributes of the landscape that would be helpful? What can we have in terms of training examples? These are models that rely, in particular, I'll talk a little bit about alternate approaches, but in particular in crop type mapping, we rely a lot on actual ground truth to train models that then can find this mapping of X onto Y. And then also there's, as you, I'm sure all are well aware, there's all sorts of different ways of mapping X onto Y, different architectures. And there's, a lot of research recently on trying to find the best types of architectures for this particular type of problem, which obviously will also depend on how many training pairs you have and how many, what types of features you have, et cetera. But for the purposes of today, I think I'll focus on the second, which is really, I think, where a lot of the progress is being made, at least in our group, and I think where kind of what the rate limiting step was historically was just not having a lot of training examples. And I think implicit in this is that often you can have training examples, say in the US, but those don't translate very well to another area. Even training examples from one part of the US may not transfer very well to another part of the US. So historically, what we've typically relied on in this field is very localized, even year-specific training data. So like when the USDA uses satellite data, they're often using data from farmers in that particular county, in that particular year, or at least in that particular state, in that particular year, very localized because the timing of the season, the differences between crops, the different crop mixes that are being grown will vary. And so it's been a real constraint is not having enough of these training pairs. And again, there are ways to try to think of more transferable approaches or transferable features, but for now, let me just focus on this problem of finding enough training pairs. There's been a couple of studies recently where we've tried to be creative about how do we get these training pairs. So there have been, lots of work around the world about just open sourcing data that has been collected scientifically, by researchers, and there is a growing amount of public data in that domain. But trying to think about really reaching scale very quickly, we started talking with a company that uses phone-based recommendation systems for farmers called Plantix. And what they're doing is, as shown in this picture here, they take a photo of their plant, typically with some problem, and they then submit it, and then there's a database that's being mined to recommend what the problem is and what the possible solution is. And that's their system, and they have a whole business model built around that. But they were in this process, obviously tagging what is the crop being grown. At least some farmers would enter in the top crop being grown, enough for them to be able to identify the crop in these leaf pictures of leaves or canopies. And they also know, typically with some precision, where these pictures were taken. So they have, actually millions of phones, in particular in India, millions of pictures being taken by phone at some geolocation. So we started to partner with them. This is just an example of the data they collected over a couple of seasons in India. And these two states down here, Telangana and Andhra Pradesh in the south, are where we focus this particular study, because that's where their penetration has been highest so far. And the question here is, are these phone observations good enough to actually be able to train a satellite model? So these phones are, yes, there are a lot of 2 million points, but they're pretty sporadic, as you can see here, relative to what we want, which is a complete mapping of the landscape. So can we use those point samples to train a model that then uses the imagery to map crops? And so this just is an overview of the kind of the flow of the study, where we take these crowdsource phone labels. We need to clean them quite a bit. In particular, a lot of them they'll take a leaf, but then they'll bring it over to their house or their friend's house who has a mobile phone. And so we need to find a way to robustly screen out the geolocations that's not credibly within a field. So we do that. We also do a bunch of other types of cleaning associated with, I'll give you some examples in a second, but in general, we do data cleaning. Then we use that to match up with the, in this case, we're using Sentinel-2 and Sentinel-1. These are two European satellites that have 10 meter spatial resolution. I've been collecting data for the last 4 or 5 years. And so we then, that's our features, those are our X's. And then we have these training pairs of the crop label from Plantix, the features from Sentinel. And we train in this case, we tested both CNNs and random forest to produce a estimate of the crop being grown. And so we end up with a result like this, where it's showing you here the distribution of the two main crops, rice and cotton, and also the other minor crops where things like peppers and onions and tomatoes. And then this just gives you a little bit more detail on the accuracies here. What we have to clean in terms of, as I said, whether it's in the field or not, that's down here. There is some metadata given with the phone picture on the GPS accuracy, depending on where they are and how long the GPS unit has had to calibrate itself. And then there's also some uncertainties about whether the photo was labeled as the right crop. And the reason why there's two columns here, this is showing you accuracies when we are on the left testing with a data set that has been cleaned to only the highest resolution points, only the most confident labels in the sense that they weren't labeled by a model, but they were labeled by a human, and only the points where you've got for sure a GPS location that's within a field. On the right is shown the accuracies when we're testing against the data that has not been cleaned. And the reason we're contrasting this is because in the remote sensing world, at least, it's often viewed that you really need clean data. Like you need that precision of, say, a researcher or at least a very trusted farmer providing that data. The point of our study was really that you do need that when you're testing the data set. So that's, if you see the accuracies on the left here are quite a bit higher than the accuracies on the right. And the reason is because the accuracies on the right are being judged against a very noisy reference. And so you'd expect those accuracies to be lower. But what we're showing in the different bars here is that if you actually only train on the very clean data, which you can think of as the top bar in each of these, you actually don't really do better than training on the noisier data, because you're trading off basically a number of samples versus the quality of samples. And that noise is random enough that if you increase the number of samples, for example, you have a huge increase going from the expert labeled samples to the machine labeled samples, that increase in sample size is worth the slight decrease in precision. I'm sure this is a familiar story and for many of you in your modeling work, right? You're trading off sample size for quality, but it's just in the world of agriculture, in the world of remote sensing even, that's not an easy sell, even though in the world of advertising, I think it's well understood. A second example of this increasing training samples is pretty recent, is using another satellite actually to provide the labels. And this is a satellite called the Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation, GEDI. It's got a different kind of satellite where it's actually measuring with LiDAR the return of photons being sent down. So again, I don't know the background of everyone here, but I'm sure that LiDAR is familiar to many of you. It's used in autonomous driving, et cetera. It's also often flown on aircraft to measure the 3D topography of cities or forests or anything. But in the case of satellites, it actually hasn't been deployed historically, but it recently was launched on this GEDI satellite with a fairly high spatial resolution of 25 meters. And it was really designed with the goal of characterizing forest canopies. So this is from their website, where they just demonstrate like a forest area that looks like this will have a return profile. So as the photons get sent down, it has this waveform return where the first returns will come from the top of the canopy. You'll get a bunch of returns from there, and then you'll get an additional returns from the lower canopy, and then you have the ground here, which will give you a peak of the return. So this sensor was designed entirely to characterize forests, and all of the science goals of this mission, which is like only a 3-year mission, was to try to improve forest characterization. But as it turns out, we often are trying to distinguish crops that are different in height, and in particular in much of the world. So the most widely grown crop in the world is wheat, but second is maize or corn. And this is grown from everywhere from temperate systems like the US to very smallholder kind of poorer systems of the world where maize is often a staple. And this is just a picture from Iowa showing you the height difference between something like soybeans on the right and something like corn on the left. And the height difference is actually on the order of a meter or even slightly more than a meter. And so the idea here was, well, might LiDAR be able to distinguish these two? And if so, we can actually use the LiDAR labels at least as a tall crop, small crop, or tall crop, short crop distinction. And in effect, that would be like collecting thousands of ground samples wherever JEDI is sampling. So this just shows you an example in Iowa of JEDI. So the JEDI is just, again, sending down photons and getting them back along a transect as it goes, and it actually splits the beam so it gets multiple tracks. But you're seeing that it's very much a point sample as you go along, as in contrast to the background imagery here, which is a sentinel image, which is a complete coverage of the ground. On the right here is shown actually the USDA land cover map, so you can see how as it passes over, you can tell if it's hitting, in this case, a soybean pixel in green or a corn pixel in yellow. So
question:
yeah.
How does this relate to set aperture radar?
The
synthetic aperture, I'm sorry.
Yeah, synthetic aperture radar is very similar in that it's an active sensor that's sending down a beam of light and getting it back. It's the main difference here is the wavelength. So this is a much shorter wavelength, where it's basically anything that it hits is going to be reflected back, anything on the surface. Whereas with the longer wavelength radar, it's really going to go through a lot of stuff, and it only really it depends on the wavelength of the radar. In the case of, say, Sentinel-1, which is a C-band radar, it will go pretty shallow into the surface and then bounce back. But for example, with clouds, like a LiDAR beam will get reflected by clouds and won't be able to penetrate clouds, whereas a radar beam will be able to penetrate clouds. So it's just different wavelengths with different advantages. The key thing with the radar is it's not at all sensitive to height. It's not precise enough to be able to measure the time between sending out the signal and getting it back, and actually measure the height of the surface that it's interacting with.
Well, can it not do height of, or it does soil properties, right?
It can, yeah. So the Sentinel-1 is very sensitive to moisture and roughness of the surface, and soil properties influence both of those.
So I guess the real question is, how complementary are these? It sounds like you cannot use SAR to fill in the gaps here, but you can use it to give different information. Is that fair?
That's right. Yeah, and we could very well use the LiDAR data to train a model using the radar data. The radar data is a wall-to-wall mapping, and we have used it for crop mapping. It tends to be that the optical data, Sentinel-2, is still more useful for crop mapping unless the cloud coverage is really bad.
Got it. Thank you.
But the principle of LiDAR and radar, they're both active sensors, and they're both measuring different properties of the surface. So there's a lot of difference in the instrumentation, and like the reason that the radar is much more advanced. It's a lower energy system, given that it's a longer wavelength. Anyhow, the good news for us, or the kind of surprising thing, was that even though the stated purpose, and again the stated vertical resolution is only really designed for forests, we actually see fairly good separation. So this shows you the relative return from LiDAR. The x-axis is the percent energy return, and this y-axis is kind of a relative height measure. The 0 is because of, if you look back here, the way they define the ground is where the mode of the bottom peak is, and in the case of crops, you only get one peak, so it's incorrectly thinking that the ground is in the middle of the crop. But the key thing here is that you can see corn, which is this orange line, is really separating itself out from all of these shorter crops, which are common in the region. And so what we've done is we've taken these JEDI returns basically to classify a model which is maize, non-maize, or you can think of again as tall, short, depending on if there are other tall crops, which there are a couple in the world. You then train a model to basically use those as your labels to train a model based on Sentinel-2, and then you actually then use the Sentinel-2 model to map crops. And this bottom here is just summarizing what we find, which is that here we're using ground data for 3 regions where we actually have wall-to-wall maps from other sources. In the case of the US, it's from the USDA. And this dashed line here shows you kind of the reference accuracy of if you had local training data, how well would you do? And then these blue lines show you what happens if you basically use a model that has been trained based on the JEDI responses. So not using any ground data, but just using JEDI to classify tall, short crops. And we're not quite approaching, but we're getting fairly close to the accuracy of local training. In contrast, if you were to just use the features from the other regions, say like you had a model trained in China, but you use that in the US, you would be far. And this again shows you why historically we've often relied on local training of models. So the idea is a JEDI model, which is a very generalized feature, you can actually treat almost as ground data, and it gets you fairly close to the.
And
accuracy.
to be clear, JEDI is only over the US. That was the constraint. Is that right?
No, JEDI is available everywhere. I should have been clear. So JEDI, for example, is available in China and France. It's mostly available. Well, it's available everywhere. I mean, like a lot of sensors, the density of observations is more towards the equator. This result here, I see the question pop up, is only for 1 year. We're now expanding this geographically and over a couple of years to try to produce a large data set based on this training.
And is the motivation for doing the two-step thing? Actually, I'm not sure. Is it like a data?
Yeah. So I should have explained that clearer. So with a LiDAR sensor, all you can ever really hope for is a point sampling of the landscape. So in forestry, for example, what they do is they're collecting point samples, and then they're using that generally to combine with another source of imagery, basically to interpolate, to create a surface, right? And you can think of that interpolation as basically training a model that uses some covariate that is spatially continuous. So we're following that kind of recipe here. In this case, we're basically just mapping out tall versus short crops. In the case of forestry, they'd be mapping out, say, different types of forests. Or Greg, I'll let you read me the questions, because I don't always. I see sometimes that somebody put one, but I don't.
Yeah, so I've got a question actually, if I can just jump in verbally. Does the system revisit the same set of points very closely, even?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Okay, and then when the canopy starts to close, or before the canopy closes with these crops, do you get that sense for the actual height of the crops themselves?
Yeah, good question.
The earth, or is it just the surface of the crops, kind of?
It doesn't seem. Well, it's kind of related to your first question. If you knew you were in the same exact area, you could probably do a time differential and try to see the crop growing and measure the height of the crop. But we don't get that. So in general, what we have to be careful of is knowing that we're looking at the time of year where the crop has reached its full height, and that's when we'll see the maximum expression. So the part of our current effort is to basically go around the world, know which time you want to look at based on the optical data. When is the peak of the season? Typically, crops, they reach their peak height right at the same time they reach their peak greenness, and then they keep that height as they start to senesce throughout the season.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good question. All right, so moving on to the yield mapping. So I think I said this before, but just to be clear, like these two, the crop type mapping is kind of a prerequisite for lots of stuff, including yield mapping. So it's actually almost a harder problem to know what you're looking at than to, once you know what you're looking at, figure out how healthy it is. And the yield mapping is basically an estimate of how healthy is the crop. But obviously, like a healthy soybean crop may look quite different than a healthy maize crop, and so you want to first understand what you're looking at. Again, the challenge here is we often have very locally trained models historically, because the relationships really depend on, say, the timing of the season, the weather that was experienced, the practices that farmers use, etc. So we have the similar challenge that we have, just a lack of training data in general. Or you can think of that as the corollary of like just not very generalizable models. In this case, what we do have is we have simulation models that are fairly good at representing the relationships between, say, farm management, weather, soil conditions, and what the yields would be. And then we also have very respectable simulation models of what a crop should look like for a given state of health as it's being observed from space. And so what we've done is, instead of trying to think about how do we, for example, use phones to collect a bunch of observations of, I mean, this is something that people could do now with the progress in computer vision on phones, that you could actually take pictures of the grains and try to do a crowdsourcing of yield estimates like that way. Instead, what we're doing is we're switching ourselves into the simulation world and using that as a way of developing a lot of training data to estimate yields. So I'm not going to go into detail on this, but when you'll see this acronym SCIM, this is referring to the scalable crop yield mapper that we developed, which is basically using simulation models again to train something that converts a combination of imagery and weather into crop yield maps. We've applied this now to various types of imagery in various regions. So this is an example using Landsat in the US, where we've been able to map the entire Corn Belt down to the resolution of Landsat and map the yields. And I'll just let this play a couple of times because it gives folks an appreciation, I think, for the heterogeneity of these systems, both spatially and over time. Most of us, if we've driven through across the country, or if you live in an area that's cropped, it seems very homogeneous. It just seems like one field after another, the same field, but actually the heterogeneity is quite high. And obviously some years, like in 2012, as you'll see, you get a big drop because of drought. But even in any one year, you'll see pockets of low yields, pockets of high yields. So
let me ask a question here.
Yeah,
so
sure.
This approach depends on simulations. And so what's been your experience about how accurate they are, how many of the dynamics they actually capture?
Yeah, our experience is that they do a pretty good job at capturing the effects of water and nutrient stress on crops, and therefore our yield estimates seem to be quite good in those sets of conditions where yields are really controlled by kind of those abiotic stresses. What the models still are not very good at, and therefore what I think can fall apart on, is if any sort of late season infestation, which will cause a crop that was otherwise healthy to kind of go south quickly, like a rust or a pest, that is going to be that's going to be a challenge for this type of approach for sure. And similarly, anything that happens like very late in the season, because essentially for these crops, we're tracking the crop throughout the year. Once it looks pretty healthy by the peak of the season, that's almost always a good indicator that it's going to have a healthy crop, in part because most of these crops like corn actually are determinative, which means in the middle of the season, they actually decide how much grain to set, and whether things get better or worse after that, they've decided. And then it's just a matter of trying to fill those grains to their maximum potential. And so historically, these relationships work well because we're tracking biomass, and that's very correlated with yield. So where they fall apart, the models fall apart, but also certainly the remote sensing falls apart is when the biomass no longer tracks the yield. But historically, we've seen these do well in everywhere from rural parts of Kenya, India, Nepal, all the way to like the developed systems you're looking at here.
So this actually sounds like the simulations are good, and the phenomenon you're talking about is, I wish I had better, more comprehensive data about like pest populations or something else that comes in and messes it up.
Yeah.
Before what these things do, it sounds like you've had a good experience doing it right.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Okay, and so then the other stuff would be, pests, late
season, any late season drought or frost is a challenge. And so there have been, there's been a lot of work, as you can imagine, trying to incorporate other types of features other than things that track biomass, but things that track like late season moisture, late season pest damage. And those, I think help, especially in certain types of years or locations. Like the locust outbreak last year in Africa, there was a big, effort to try to understand what were the damages associated with that. And it's a very difficult problem because those are coming in, depending on the time. If an infestation comes in early in the season and it wipes out a crop, that's quite easy for us to detect. We don't necessarily know it was an infestation that caused the yield to be low, but we can see that there's not very much crop there, so it's a low yield. Mm-hmm. But it's the late season stuff that really will it's obviously what keeps farmers up at night too, right? They have a good crop and then they're not sure. So it's a similar thing for us.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So let me give you a couple applications. So again, so the first one is focused on drought, and we know, we certainly know that drought affects yields. That's not a new question. The question here is really around have the new technologies that have come in particular in the U.S. Have they helped to adapt to the drought conditions? So a lot of the hope with climate change, for example, is that our systems are very smart and adaptive, and they will, over time, become more and more able to deal with these dry conditions. The problem with the traditional data sets we have, as shown like here, this is like the best you can get from government statistics, which is county level information on drought, is that this is averaging over, on the order of 100 square kilometers or more. It's good for tracking over time, say how, as a county gets hit with a drought, how does the overall productivity of that county go down? But it's not a very long record. It does go back, say, 50 years. But if we're trying to understand changes over the last 20 years, you have basically 20 years at a county level. It's very hard to detect whether the effects of a drought, which are only coming along, say, once every 10 years, whether those are getting more or less severe. So one thing we tried to do here was say, okay, well, if we have very fine scale data, this shows you an example for a county in Indiana, where we have very fine scale yield data, as shown on the right here. This is all the fields that were sown that year in that county to corn. And you can see, again, the heterogeneity, a 50% difference easily between some farms and others. If we have that kind of richness of spatial detail, can we begin to understand on a year-to-year basis, basically, how do yields differ depending on the amount of water stress being experienced? And then we are able to then have a 20-year record of looking at those spatial differences, which is a much more robust way of trying to detect whether things are changing than trying to wait once every 10 years to see how a county responded to a shock that the county experienced. And so what we're utilizing here is that spatial contrast. And actually, most of that spatial contrast doesn't come from the fact that the weather was different in one part of the county than the other. It comes from what's shown on the left here, which is the water holding capacity of the soil. This is plant available water storage. This is just a fixed characteristic of the soil, which is how much water can be stored. And you can see that, in this case, in the western part of the county, there's much deeper soils that are able to hold much more water than the eastern or northern parts of this county. So that gradient of water holding capacity provides us a gradient of water stress. In some years, that gradient will be more important, right? Because there'll be less water in the rainfall and more requirement of the soil to provide that water storage. And in other years, it'll be less important. But what we're able to do is look year after year in this county and year after year in every county in the US about how that water stress gradient is affecting productivity. This is something that, again, you couldn't really hope to do at the county level because there's just, not that amount of variation over time. And if you're trying to then start comparing, say, one county to a neighboring county, first of all, there's not that many counties, but second of all, there's lots of differences as you go across counties that come into play. Things like different latitude, different weather, different practices, different policies at the state level, et cetera. Within a county, you can be fairly confident you're looking at differences just associated to water stress.
Ming, you have a question?
Hi, Professor Lobell. Could you please explain where does this yield data come from?
Yeah, so this particular yield data is just kind of a zoomed in version of this right here. So I've just like frozen this in time. I've switched the color scale, unfortunately. I prefer this color scale, but my postdoc who made this figure prefers this one. So anyhow, that is just the satellite-based estimates of yield.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so what we did in this particular study was we tried to look at these gradients within counties, again, for all counties over time, and understand how that's changing. So this is just basically a summary figure of, on average, across all the counties, if you look, what is that gradient within a county? What is that sensitivity of yield to that difference in the water storage capacity? And what we found, interestingly, was that, obviously there's a positive effect of having more water storage. That's why all these coefficients are positive. But what we found, interestingly, was that is increasing quite a bit over time. So that in 2020, we have maybe something like 50% more sensitivity to that water storage than in 2000. you can see in particular dry years that becomes very important. But even if you remove this year, we see a very significant trend. And in fact, the end of the the end of this period, like around 2020, was not noticeably drier or even that much hotter actually than 2000 in this region. But what we see is nonetheless a pretty substantial increase in the sensitivity. And the explanation for this is really that the management techniques have changed for sure. And those management techniques have actually made the system more sensitive to water. The reason being that these management techniques and the technologies like the new seeds are actually able to produce much more in good conditions. And so it's not so much that they're getting worse at all in the dry conditions. They're just on those soils with deep water, they're able to get even higher yields. And this is a story that it plays out throughout the country. We see this in all the different regions. So that's one example application where we use that fine scale detail. Another one is a recent study we did on air pollution.
A question on that one.
Yeah.
So you were using water storage capacity or soil moisture?
We looked at both. I think they showed very similar trends. The reason we want to look at something fixed like water storage capacity of the soil is that it's a little bit easier to make a causal statement about one thing causing the other. If you don't have, it could be that farmer management or behavior is actually influencing any particular year's water moisture levels. So, but in the end, they showed very similar patterns.
Well, so let me understand kind of the decision, because I'm also thinking California. Some farmers get water, some farmers do not. And then it doesn't matter what the capacity is. It matters, did they get water? So moisture should tell you that. Yeah,
that's true. And I should have been clear that for the majority of the Corn Belt, and certainly this whole region we're looking at, this is a rain-fed system. So the water provision is really rainfall. And then the soil is dictating how much of that gets stored. And then obviously the practices will influence things like runoff and things like evaporation, which could also influence how much in that particular year is making its way into the soil and then into the plant.
So then let me understand, wouldn't the dynamic measurement be much better? Or am I missing something important here that
the reason, so we included both. The particular reviewer thought the dynamic measure, which would be much better as a measure of sensitivity. But the idea is if you're trying to say that, if you're trying to say something about the sensitivity of the system, in particular the crops and the farmers that grow them, the sensitivity of that system to some exogenous factor like water availability, you don't want to use a variable that the farmers themselves can influence. And so the idea is that this soil water storage is some inherent exogenous like condition that is not influenced by the farmer itself, but influences the farmer. So you only have one plausible direction of causality, even though you may argue that that's less of a direct effect on farmers than what the actual moisture is. The problem with the actual moisture is that the farmers can influence it. So it's really a causal inference kind of concern. But in the end, a lot of the concerns about causal inference are overblown. And in fact, the relationships are very similar if we look at actual moisture.
Okay, so this is actually instrumental variable then?
Yeah.
Oh, got it.
Okay, I should have said that, yeah. All right, so actually that'll apply here as well. So in the more recent study, we're looking at air pollution. And again, this is something that we understand in general, air pollution is not good, but the kind of questions we have is, how bad is it specifically? Are we getting less sensitive to it, more sensitive to it? And these kind of answers will help basically understand, how much of a priority should it be in terms of addressing? Is it a problem that's getting worse? Is it a problem that's small? Is it a problem that's big, et cetera? So what we've done here is look at two types of information on pollution. One is the EPA does have monitors around the country, and they're actually not as dense as I would have thought, especially for some pollutants. The thing I didn't realize is actually that there's different stations measuring different pollutants. So if you look at, for example, ozone measurements, there's lots of those, but if you look at particulate matter measurements, those are often different stations, and there's still a lot of those, but not quite as many. And if you look at things like nitrogen dioxide or sulfur dioxide, there's actually far fewer. Anyhow, you have the stations where you're actually measuring the pollutants, but then you also know the locations of a major source of pollution, which is the power plants, and their activity on a year-to-year basis of how much they're emitting, because these are all monitored by the EPA. And so what I've done in this figure is attempt to show you both the background yield information, the locations of the power plants in orange, and then a little bit harder to see because there's a lot of them and the points are not that big, but you can see these, hopefully these black X's around the country, which are showing, you can see there's clusters of them around cities where there's a lot of monitors, but throughout the country, there's a lot of them, often in, or sometimes in rural settings. And so if we look, for example, at, this is kind of combining those two pollution measurements to understand at the monitoring stations, how much does the pollution depend on the distance from the power plant? What we're trying to get here is a sense of what's the spatial scale of pollution relative to the sources of emission. Because we're going to then use those spatial gradients, just like we use the soil gradients, we're going to use those gradients as a way to contrast or compare with our yield gradients and understand what's driving the yield differences. And so, not surprisingly, as you go further from a power plant, so this is distance of a monitoring station, the distance to the closest power plant, you can see the pollution declines. This is just relative, 100 being the scale of equal to the emissions very close to the power plant. You see that they decline. You can see that some pollutants decline very rapidly, like nitrogen dioxide. Some pollutants decline much more gradually, like ozone. This is AOT is a measure of atmospheric ozone or surface level ozone levels. There's some interesting chemistry involved with why some decline more than others. There's also just the fact that there's maybe more other sources of some of these pollutants than power plants. If power plant being the main source of sulfur and nitrogen dioxide, they tend to dissipate more quickly as you get away from those sources. So the point here is that we can measure yields, and I should have, I guess, shown this. We can measure yields around the monitoring stations themselves. That's simple enough. But as I said before, the problem is there's only so many of those monitoring stations, and in particular, they're very good for ozone, but they're not very good for the other pollutants. At the same time, we can measure yields as you move away from the power plants, and there's actually quite a lot of information on where power plants are. These orange dots all around the country, but often they're without any monitoring station nearby. So what we're looking at is, on average, as you move away from power plants throughout the country, how does pollution decline by using these X's? And then we're going to look at the yields in the vicinity of all of the power plants and understand how that might provide evidence for the effects of the pollution. So I'm giving you like kind of the intuition here and not the full set of equations, but ultimately what we do is we're basically taking these yield gradients, which we do see fairly significant yield gradients near power plants. So yields increase as you move away from power plants. And we're comparing that to the pollution gradients. And at the same time, we're using the yields around the monitoring stations as a constraint as well. And so ultimately what we get is an estimate of how important each of these pollutants are to yield. And then we can also estimate how in each year the exposure of crops, how big the exposure was to each of these pollutants, and then how that has changed over time. So let's just focus on the middle panel here from this figure, from this paper, is this looks at the total impact of all the pollutants added up. This shows you the impacts of particulate matters. This shows you the impacts of nitrogen dioxide, and here it's ozone and sulfur dioxide. So I guess the headline result here is that we see all 4 pollutants actually having a significant negative effect. We see that the total effects have been declining over time because, as shown here, the level of pollutants with the Clean Air amendments have been declining over time. And so this is actually not anymore a sizable problem. It just, for those who aren't used to thinking about agriculture, something like a 10% loss is a big deal in any system, but particularly in the US, where the system is really trying to eke out gains on top of strong historical growth, trying to eke out those extra little bit of gains. Like a big company trying to eke out a little bit extra profit margin is difficult. So something that's causing a drag of, say, 8 to 10% is a large deal. But we've also seen these clean air trends have actually benefited quite a bit. And in this study, we estimate that the current losses are on the order of 5% for pollution in maize, a little bit less than that in soybean.
Professor, I'd seen something recently about sulfur deficiency as being an issue with wheat. Is there any benefit of being closer to these sources of sulfur dioxide at all? Or
yeah, that's a great question. I mean, going into this, we had some, I guess, hypothesis that you would be worse off being closer to the power plants. But one question, and I'll get to your question, but one question was like some of these fairly new modern power plants, they're pretty good at controlling particulate matter and sulfur dioxide and to some extent nitrogen dioxide, but they're still spewing out a lot of CO2, obviously. And one of the questions was, well, maybe there's a benefit of being close to a very high CO2 source because crops do benefit from high CO2. As you say, there might be benefits of sulfur deposition, in particular in parts of the South where there's actually, historically there was a lot of sulfur deposited, right? As air was very sulfur rich. And as that's declined, there's been more symptoms of sulfur deficiency in fields. On net, we still see that the direct toxic effects of sulfur dioxide outweigh any benefits you get from sulfur in the soil. But it is the case that, this is the average effects, and it may well be that there are particular systems where the net effects might be zero or even slightly positive.
Cool. And then a separate question, but is the relative position towards the power plant matter here in terms of like prevailing winds and things like that?
Yeah, we looked a lot at that. In part because of like what Greg was asking before about causal inference and instruments, like it's often very useful to have that like downwind upwind comparison to be sure it's not just that you're close to a power plant, but that it's the pollution itself. In the end, we actually see that the winds in this part of the world at this particular time of year are pretty variable and not very strong. And so if you look, for example, at pollution downwind versus upwind of the power plants, it's just not that big of a contrast. Partly because even if you're upwind of one power plant, you tend to be downwind of another one, but partly because the winds are just not very strong. So what we ended up doing more in terms of really driving home the causal inference was looking at power plants that switch on and off, because there is shutdown of coal plants over this period. There are new plants coming online, and so what we see is that the closer you are to a plant, as it turns on, you start to lose relative to the fields that are distant. Then as that plant shuts off, you start to then regain pretty quickly close. And it is the case that on average the fields closer to power plants are not as good as the ones a little further, even when the power plants are not active. Again, that might be partly because power plants maybe are close to other power plants. But in general, you see that those gradients really grow as plants get switched on, and then they shrink again as plants get switched off. It's interesting if you just look at this kind of overall, this is the average yield over time. And if you kind of squint, there are these broad patterns due to weather. There are certainly, some patterns due to soil differences. But if you kind of look for these holes of areas that are in between power plants where like there's very few cropping areas actually that are, more than 30 kilometers or more than 50 kilometers even from any power plant, these are like the very low pollution areas of the country. And again, this is not the analysis we did, but if you can almost see it visually if you squint that you tend to get higher yields in these pristine areas, relatively pristine areas. Okay, well that's all really I had to say. I think the thesis of what we've been working on over the last at least 5 years or so is that going down to the field scale really gives you just an order of magnitude more information on farm performance. We've been, I talked today a lot about environmental impacts and how we can use these gradients to understand that. But one of the biggest things you can get at the field scales is that huge variation in management practices. So things like tracking, did an intervention like a big soil intervention work? Well, you can compare fields that did and didn't get the intervention in a way that you can't with administrative data. So anyhow, the idea here is that we're getting very quickly towards a world where we can map out what every single field in the world is doing every year in terms of at least in terms of crop type and yield. And there's a whole suite of management practices that increasingly are being observed or can be observed with some of the imagery that's available. So, trying to think ahead, I think, we're very quickly getting to a very data-rich world in agriculture where historically we've been in a very data-poor world. And I think that will open up, as ever, it'll open up interesting opportunities, both for good and ill. And I think scientifically at least, it's going to help us much more quickly understand, the small fraction of things that are actually very effective versus, all of the things people try and don't really have that much of an impact. And similarly, the types of environmental issues that or changes that are going to have a big impact versus those that will not matter that much. So it's really about trying to be able to quickly prioritize and then ideally inform more controlled experiments that can really nail down the exact mechanisms and impact. But this is hopefully analogous to a lot of things you guys are used to thinking about. As you get into a data-rich world, how do you leverage that information to combine with more traditional ways of understanding to get deeper quicker? And that's all. I am happy to take more questions if there are.
Okay. Thank you very much, David. Any other questions?
Oh, I should since there are more questions, I should acknowledge that maybe it was implicit, but I didn't actually remember to say it at the start, is that Google has been a huge resource, in particular from the Earth Engine tools that have been, not just for me, for the whole community, has really transformed our ability to do science. All of the yield data sets I showed, a lot of the crop mapping I showed it's been, a huge time saver and facilitator to be able to use that platform, not to mention like the technical assistance they provide at times. And then a lot of the projects we've done, not necessarily the ones I showed today, but a lot of more like deep learning, projects around, Greg mentioned poverty, or in some cases agricultural applications, have really benefited from we do them often through classes where we use a lot of Google credits. So, rest assured that Google is really helping to fertilize this area of research. And then a lot of this is also supported by NASA.
Cool. No, it's really good that Google is actually like supporting this actively. So now, what other data sets might be useful? So we talked about like pests. Are there other things like proximity to cities or foot traffic or anything else that might shed a different light on these questions?
Yeah, I think for each question, there's probably like a suite of data sets that would be nice to have. One of the things we're looking at now, for example, is trying to understand how much the subsurface influences agriculture in these high productivity regions, because as the crops get more and more productive, their ability to, not only get nutrients deep in the soil, but water, often from shallow water tables, is growing in importance. And so we're trying to, piece together better data sets on what is the subsurface water hydrology looking like. That's one area but I think, historically what we're really not good at doing is tracking in detail soil properties and farm management. That we're getting to the point where more of those data sets are georeferenced. We're not really at a point yet where we have like a credible way of obtaining good public information on those things. A lot of it is in the private sector. And so, we can partner with the private sector, but, a lot of what we're trying to do here is create tools that will be rapidly applicable to areas where the private sector isn't very active. So, I think, better tools for rapid soil characterization, better tools for rapid georeferenced management information, those kind of things are still a big need.
Okay, that makes sense. And then one more. It seems like a lot of this is applicable to analyzing forests. So I'm thinking forest fire stuff. So if you want to do a controlled burn, you probably want to do it where there's been a lot of growth for the past 20 years, and now it's very dry. It sounds like you should be able to map that. Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of, I think in Earth Engine crowd, like as you I'm sure are aware, like there's a wide community, and there's actually a whole bunch of people developing tools in Earth Engine trying to do that, like trying to monitor both the fire situation, but also the fuel loads. And I'm sure there's some people working on kind of designing the optimum intervention strategies. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the useful things about being in the remote sensing world is that you'll see a lot of different scientific domains where some of them have traditionally been, data poor, and so they're often more creative about how they use different types of data. And agriculture traditionally, as I said, was data poor relative to, say, web information, but relative to like forestry or relative to biodiversity, it was data rich. And so sometimes we get inspired by looking to I would say some of the more creative, like I was mentioning JEDI before, like the whole JEDI program, the whole use of different types of training data. I think that was kind of built out of necessity. There has been no LiDAR mission planned or funded for agriculture because it wasn't viewed as necessary. So just in general, I think there's applications across all sorts of ecosystem areas: forestry, agriculture, shrubland monitoring, wetland monitoring. A lot of cool stuff going on now.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Thank you. This was fantastic. Very informative.
Great. Well, thanks for having me.